Dolores is 24, sitting in a Chicago stewardess school waiting room in 1962, a girdle folded inside her handbag, a tape measure resting nearby on a clipboard, an envelope of mailed applications still unanswered in her lap. On the wall hangs a height-weight chart marked in careful black lettering. The rules said any qualified woman would fly. Number 1 reveals the exact courtroom number that finally forced the sky open. Number 12, the tape measure test. The tape measure goes around the hips first, then the waist, then up against a wall chart marked in careful black lettering. Height, 5'2" to 5'9", depending on the carrier. Weight, somewhere between 100 and 135 pounds, proportionate to height. Dolores already knows her own numbers before she even sits down. She has known them for months, the way other girls know a hymn. The chart looks like science. It is not. It is a beauty filter wearing a ruler's clothes. A girl could be flawless in posture, in patience, in poise, and still lose her chance over half an inch on a measuring tape. The pencil scratches against the clipboard. A supervisor circles a number without ever looking up at the face attached to it. Nobody explains the rule out loud. Nobody has to. It is printed right there on the wall, plain as a price tag. And every applicant in that room has already memorized it like scripture, repeated it in the mirror, prayed her own body would simply match it. The chart did not care how she felt about any of it. It only cared what the tape said when it was pulled tight. And the tape, it turns out, was only the first thing in that waiting room quietly watching her. Number 11. The hair that had to be natural. The night before, Dolores presses her hair, sets it, pins it down tight against her scalp. Because the listing on the application says hair must be natural, neatly groomed, no longer than the shoulder. Natural sounds like the simplest word on the page. It is not. For her, that single word carries a second meaning that nobody ever bothers to print. Hot pressing oil fills the small bathroom. The iron hisses against each section. Bobby pins click into a metal tin, one at a time. Industry hiring language of the period leaned on phrases exactly like this one, and some carriers used hair texture as a quiet, deniable way of deciding who belonged. Before a single interview even began, a hairstyle judged wrong could end the whole process before it properly started. With no explanation offered to the girl walking out the door because none was ever required of the person turning her away. The same word applied to two different women standing in the same line somehow did two entirely different jobs. That is the part the chart on the wall never admitted to anyone filling out an application. The hair rule and the tape measure both wore the mask of a neutral, scientific standard. The next rule on this list does not even bother wearing one. Number 10. The geisha standard. On the bulletin board behind the receptionist's desk hangs a glossy Pan Am recruiting poster. Smiling women in crisp uniforms boarding a gleaming new aircraft bound somewhere across the Pacific. Pan Am had been hiring Japanese-American stewardesses out of Honolulu since 1955, building an entire route image around them so deliberately that one airline executive had openly said he wanted the women to act like geisha girls for the comfort of male passengers. Dolores studies the poster for a long moment, while a desk fan hums against the glossy paper, stirring the edge just slightly. Diversity already existed inside this industry. It was simply selective, and it was simply chosen because someone in a marketing office decided it would sell tickets. An airline that could imagine one kind of difference as glamorous somehow could not imagine another kind as anything beyond a liability worth avoiding. It was never that the industry lacked imagination for these things. It chose, carefully, where that imagination would be allowed to go. Being the wrong kind of different did not earn a woman judgment and rejection at the front desk. It earned her something quieter and harder to fight. She simply never appeared in the recruiter's plans at all. If a company could build an entire marketing campaign out of one woman's background, the next question on this list practically writes itself for anyone paying attention. Number 9. The letter that never came. Every single afternoon, Dolores walks down to check the mailbox. The metal door creaks open on its hinge, and her hand comes back empty again, the way it has for weeks now. She has applications out with several regional carriers, mailed the very same week as girls she trained beside in this same building. Girls who now wear silver wings pinned to a lapel, while Dolores still wears a girdle and a clipboard number nobody assigned a future to. This was the documented pattern among black graduates of stewardess schools across the country. They watched their white classmates open envelopes containing job offers, while their own letters simply never arrived at all. Not delayed, not returned, just absent. No rejection slip landed in the box. No phone call came through to explain anything. There was nothing here to formally appeal because nothing had technically been sent in the first place. Silence did the discriminating quietly, efficiently, and silence cannot easily be cross-examined in any office or any courtroom. That was, in its own way, the cruelest rule of the entire system, the one never spoken aloud, never printed on letterhead, never signed by a single person who could later be asked to explain it. Dolores closes the mailbox softly and walks back inside. Tomorrow she will check it again, exactly the same way. That particular silence held for a long time across the whole country. It held right up until enough women finally decided that silence itself required an answer, spoken out loud, in a place where it could actually be heard by someone with the power to respond. Number 8. The word in the boardroom. A folded newspaper clipping makes its way slowly around the waiting room, passed from hand to hand until the corners have gone soft and gray. Somebody's older brother works downtown and brought it home from his office. It quotes an airline's own internal reasoning, reported plainly in the press at the time, hiring black stewardesses. The thinking went, would downgrade the glamour of the job and shrink the pool of white applicants still willing to take it. Dolores reads the clipping twice, slowly, while newsprint ink rubs gray onto the tip of her finger. This was never a skills argument framed against her. It was a marketing argument, dressed carefully to sound like simple business sense, and it had quietly closed an entire career path before she had even submitted her first application. The job's glamour, it turned out, carried a very specific definition behind closed doors, and that definition excluded her on purpose, not by some unfortunate accident anyone could later apologize for. A decision made inside one boardroom could travel a remarkably long way from that boardroom. It could land, eventually, in a Chicago waiting room, folded soft in the hands of a girl who had never once set foot near that downtown office building. And once a sentence like that gets typed up and printed for the public to read, it rarely stays contained inside one local newspaper for very long at all. Number 7. The headline, Moscow printed first. Word spreads quietly through the waiting room about a different kind of newspaper, one most of these girls have never personally laid eyes on themselves. In 1958, the NAACP's own national magazine reported that the United States State Department had been forced to admit something genuinely uncomfortable, that the Soviet paper Pravda's coverage of airline discrimination against black women applying to fly had in fact been accurate all along. Dolores absorbs this slowly, sitting with it the way you sit with something too large for one waiting room. A radio in the corner hums low static between songs. This was no longer a story confined to one office, one airline, or one disappointed applicant standing at a mailbox. It had crossed an entire ocean and landed squarely inside a Cold War argument about which country could honestly claim to treat its own citizens with any fairness at all. A rule that had cost one woman a single job had somehow become a rule that cost an entire country its standing on the world stage. Diplomats, of all people, were suddenly arguing about the very same chart hanging quietly on this waiting room wall. It strikes Dolores as strange that her own private problem had quietly become someone else's international embarrassment to manage. Pressure arriving from outside the country was one particular kind of weight bearing down on the industry. What happened next happened much closer to home, inside a room with a wooden bench and a bailiff standing near the door. Number 6. The courtroom tape measure. In a courtroom somewhere, a bailiff's chair scrapes hard against the floor as a black applicant rises and takes the witness stand. With backing from the NAACP and the National Urban League, lawsuits had begun moving steadily through the courts on behalf of women who had met every published qualification on the page and still never received a single offer in return. One plaintiff recited her own measurements directly into the official record, 33, 22, 36, offered as proof, entered formally as legal evidence, that she matched the airline's own published feminine ideal precisely. The number echoes briefly into an otherwise silent room. Pencils scratch against legal pads at the long table where company lawyers sit. The very same tape measure from a Chicago waiting room had now become sworn courtroom testimony, copied word for word into a transcript that would outlast every memo any airline executive had ever quietly approved. A test built to remain private had become a public spectacle, recited aloud under oath in front of strangers, simply to demonstrate that a company's own published standard should be made to apply equally to the woman standing in that witness box. Until this point, the rule had lived quietly in a mirror, a hairpin, a folded clipping passed hand to hand. From here forward, it lived permanently in a court file, typed and bound and impossible to quietly misplace in some forgotten drawer. The chart on the wall itself had not changed one single number. What changed was who finally got to argue about it, under oath, in front of a judge, with a transcript that could not simply be thrown away or denied later by anyone involved in writing it. Number 5. Too masculine, too arrogant. A typed legal filing sits on an attorney's desk, carbon paper still faintly rasping where the second copy was pulled free from the typewriter roller. In one of these cases, a black applicant was described in sworn testimony as too masculine, carrying an arrogant attitude, and the simple, plain fact that she had filed a lawsuit at all was offered up as supposed proof of an antagonistic disposition unsuited to passenger-facing work. Dolores hears about it secondhand, weeks later, sitting in that same waiting room, and understands the trap instantly, the way you recognize a familiar shape in the dark before your eyes fully adjust. Silence proved nothing useful against you. Speaking up proved, apparently, that you did not deserve to be heard in the first place. A closed loop, built carefully enough that a woman lost no matter which direction she chose to move in, no matter how patient or how forceful she decided to be. A briefcase latch clicks shut firmly on the desk, papers tucked inside for the next hearing on a different docket entirely. The work itself was real. The qualifications listed on her application were entirely real. The argument constructed against her had nothing whatsoever to do with either one of those things, only with how a woman defending herself could be reframed as the problem. And still, against a system built that deliberately tight, women kept walking into those courtrooms anyway, one after another, case after case, year after year, until something on the other side of that door finally had no choice left but to give way. Number 4. The cover of Jet. A newsstand rack on a Chicago street corner holds the new issue, glossy under the orange glow of a streetlight overhead, the cover catching the light just enough to draw a passing eye. In 1962, one of the very first successful plaintiffs from these cases appeared right there on the cover of Jet magazine, photographed in a Northwest Airlines uniform, the silver wings pinned exactly where they had always belonged on every other stewardess in the country. Dolores buys her own copy on the walk home and folds it carefully into her handbag, where it stays through every single interview that follows after that day, tucked beside the same chart she has carried since the very first afternoon. The slick cover paper softens at the crease within only a week of constant handling, the way any photograph does once it becomes something closer to a charm than a magazine. A courtroom win is, in the end, mostly a private document, read by lawyers, filed quietly away in some drawer, where no one outside the case will ever see it. A magazine cover is something else entirely, something public and shared, passed from sister to cousin to neighbor down the block. It becomes proof that 1,000 other women can hold directly in their own two hands, on their own kitchen tables, in their own neighborhoods, in cities the original lawsuit never touched. The photograph accomplished something the legal filing alone never quite could. It made the win visible, all at once, to every single girl like Dolores, who had spent months checking an empty mailbox and beginning to wonder if any of it would ever change for her. One cover, on its own, was not the end of anything yet. A year later, a single headline would change the entire shape of the conversation. Number 3. Open skies for Negro girls. At her mother's kitchen table, Dolores spreads open a 1,963 issue of Ebony, the headline printed across the page in heavy black type that seems to fill the entire room. Open skies for Negro girls. The Chicago Defender had publicly praised American Airlines that same season for promoting its first black stewardess into a supervisor role, while the Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized a boycott against Delta over how few black employees the airline actually kept on staff company-wide. Newspaper ink smudges faintly on the tablecloth where her mother's thumb rests against the page, tracing the headline word by word, mouthing it slightly the way people read something they still cannot quite believe. The headline sounds, on its face, like total and complete victory. It is not, quite, not yet. Public pressure, organized boycotts, sustained magazine coverage, together all of it, forced real movement at the company level, in a way that a single courtroom victory alone had never quite managed to do on its own. Not without an audience watching. An airline that chose to ignore that kind of pressure now risked something larger than one more lawsuit filed quietly in some county courthouse. It risked seeing its own name printed across the front of tomorrow's black newspapers, read aloud at kitchen tables exactly like this one, in cities its own recruiters had never once bothered to visit. The sky was opening, slowly, in print before it opened anywhere else. The next number on this list shows precisely how slowly, and precisely how few women actually managed to walk through that newly opened door in the years immediately following the headline. Number 2, 50 Women, One Industry. A roster page, thin and freshly typed, lists names down the margin in careful alphabetical order, the kind of document meant only for internal filing, never for public view. By 1965, roughly 50 African American women worked as stewardesses across the entire American airline industry combined. 50 women inside an industry that employed tens of thousands of stewardesses nationwide, in cities Dolores has only ever seen printed on a departure board. By the time the Boeing 747 launched at the close of the decade, that number had grown to nearly 1,000 industry-wide, with Pan Am alone employing around 100 black stewardesses, though even Pan Am's own recruitment efforts stalled soon afterward, slowed by recruiter bias, by the constant pressure to match a beauty standard never built with her in mind to begin with, and by the plain financial weight of unpaid training weeks and a starting wage few families could easily absorb without help from somewhere else in the household. A mimeograph machine hums somewhere down the hallway, copying the same thin roster for another regional office entirely, the ink still slightly damp on each new page as it comes off the drum. Dolores becomes one line on that page, one of the documented 50, then watches the number grow slowly around her across the years that follow her own hiring. New names added a few at a time rather than all at once. Legal victory and actual on-the-ground hiring, it turns out, moved at two very different speeds entirely, one measured in courtroom verdicts and the other in slow, reluctant paperwork. The sky had not stayed closed after the headlines ran. It had simply opened one careful inch at a time, for far longer than anyone in those newspaper offices wanted to admit out loud to their own readers. One number remains. It is the number that finally explains why every single rule before it existed in the first place. Number 1. The job you had to win twice. Dolores holds her hiring letter in one hand. In the other, folded soft from years of carrying, sits the original height-weight chart she copied down by hand that very first afternoon in the waiting room. The published qualifications had never been the entire test. Not really. Not completely. Height, weight, posture, grooming. Any sufficiently determined woman could meet those requirements on paper, and a great many of them did exactly that. Underneath that printed chart sat a second, unwritten filter entirely, one built from hair texture, from quiet marketing decisions, from boardroom fears about glamour and brand image, one that no employee handbook ever officially admitted existed at all. Meeting the printed rule was supposed to be enough on its own. For Dolores, and for the real, documented women whose cases came years before hers ever did, meeting the rule was only step 1 of 2. Step 2 was proving, sometimes inside a courtroom under oath, sometimes through a magazine cover passed hand to hand, sometimes through an organized boycott that put a company's name across every black newspaper in the country for weeks, that the rule actually had to apply to her too, in practice, and not merely on paper. That particular work did not end with a single case or a single cover story. The same Civil Rights Act that had quietly backed those early lawsuits would later become the larger legal tool an entire generation of stewardesses used to challenge marriage rules, age limits, weigh-ins, and pregnancy firings across the whole industry, reshaping the job itself for every woman who came along after them. The uniform jacket Dolores finally puts on that morning is stiff with newness, the fabric still holding its factory crease along both sleeves. From the outside, it looks exactly like every other stewardess's uniform boarding that same flight, indistinguishable in any photograph. That is the part the public was never shown in any advertisement. The glamour itself was real. The uniform was entirely real. But for certain women, the simple right to be judged by the very same rule as everyone else standing beside her at the gate had to be won first, in places far removed from any runway, long before she was ever finally allowed to stand there and be told, simply, that she qualified after all. Dolores still keeps that chart, folded soft, behind the letter that finally arrived. The tape measure rule never changed. What changed was who it was allowed to serve. Some rules were printed in handbooks. The ones that kept her out were never written down. If a rule like this touched your family, an envelope, a name once printed on a roster, tell us below and subscribe for the next code.